When deputies finally pried up the warped trapdoor beneath the teacher's desk, the air that breathed out of the schoolhouse smelled like broth and iron, and something that did not belong to a place where children learned their letters. On the steps was a single shoe, no larger than a man's palm, its laces tied in a neat, careful bow. The shoe would become the most photographed object in the county for a season. The ledger they found next to it would become the most whispered because, alongside the roll call and penmanship grades, it contained a second list written in a different hand, careful as needlework, where the words lunch, portion, and first names were copied in a column that stopped abruptly in the spring of 1873. Before we go deeper, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and whether you grew up near an old one-room school. And if it's your first time here, hit subscribe so you don't miss stories like this. We're going to Cedar Hollow, Pennsylvania, 1873, the year the bell in Miss Eliza Hart's schoolhouse started ringing for fewer children than the desks could seat. Cedar Hollow was the sort of place you drove past on your way to somewhere people had heard of. A curve of dirt road, notched between a stone creek and a hill, knit with oaks, a clapboard church, a general store that smelled like coffee and axle grease, a blacksmith shed with a railroad calendar tacked to the wall 2 years out of date. The panic of 1873 had rolled across the state like a slow, cold flood. Fathers took work where they could, sometimes far from home, and sometimes they did not come back at all. Mothers took in laundry. Older boys hired themselves out to the quarry. Younger children swung empty dinner pails and tried to sit up straight from McGuffey's reader while a coal stove creaked and popped in the corner. The schoolhouse stood a little apart from the road, as if someone had once pushed it there and it had decided to stay. White paint had surrendered to weather. One cracked bell hung in a simple belfry. Under the floor, a stone cellar kept potatoes and coal cool through the summer. A hinged square of plank at the teacher's feet led down to the dark. Eliza Hart arrived the fall, before from a normal school out near Westchester. She was 37, unwed, not pretty in the way people meant it, but composed. When she smiled at a child, she did it with her whole face, every muscle standing at attention. She wore dark dresses, a brooch shaped like a forget-me-not, and a ring made from woven hair on a ribbon around her neck that folks assumed was for a lost fiancé. She boarded with the widow Tally, paid on time, and on Sundays she sang alto at St. Luke's from memory, never glancing at the hymnal. She kept the schoolhouse spotless, her chalk stacked like bones in a neat little pyramid, every slate washed, every desk scrubbed. Her penmanship could have been printed by a machine. The children need order, she told the board. Order makes a child feel held. The older men on the board nodded, because that sounded like education, and the younger ones nodded because of the way she said it. Eliza believed in feeding children. She started a hot lunch routine herself, she said, because too many little hands shook with hunger by noon, and a hot bowl calmed them. She brought a tin washtub to the stove and a big pot that clanged like a bell when she set it down. She boiled bones and onions on Mondays, barley and carrots on Wednesdays, beans when the widow Tally's garden obliged. Sometimes she made a thick brown stew on Fridays that brought even men at the store out to the porch to sniff and joke about opening their purses to pay tuition. She never took money for the lunches and never let a child leave hungry. A fed child learns, she said, and she would watch them eat with her hands folded over her apron, eyes bright as if the spoonfuls were compliments. Attendance that winter was better than anyone remembered. Eliza ran her hand down the roll each morning, like a pianist checking keys, and said every name with care. The schoolhouse felt cocooned from the world's trouble. Parents spoke about it at supper and in the pews. How Miss Hart had a way of quieting boys who clawed at each other like barn cats. How the little ones could write their names now. How a child who had stuttered his whole life recited the days of the week like a bell counting hours. She sent home notes folded like little boats, each in the same precise hand, praising and instructing. Mothers kept those notes in cookbooks, like recipes. When it snowed, she roped the older boys to shovel a path and then ladled stew until the steam turned the room into a dreamy fog. February put a crack in the shell. It began with small things you could throw away if you tried. Rebecca Mullins came home with a ribbon that wasn't hers and couldn't say when she'd gotten it. A farmhand, passing at dusk, told his wife he'd seen lantern light through the schoolhouse window long after the bell, and figures moving the way children move when they are being told to move quietly. A dog refused to go near the porch steps, hackles up and tail tucked, and the animal had never refused anything, not rabbit, not creek, not thunder. A man who came to the door with egg money told his wife that Miss Hart had a smell about her like smoked meat that lingered after she'd gone back to the pot. But the pot smelled wonderful. That had been the running joke all winter. It's amazing what your mind can fold up and put on a shelf when you need a warm thought more than a cold one. In March, a boy didn't come home. His name was Caleb Thrush, 13, rope thin with a cowlick that climbed out of any amount of water. His mother put supper on the hob and took it off and put it back on the hob and took it off. She asked in the store, walked to the quarry, sent her older girl to the Widow Tally's with a covered plate. When no one could say they'd seen him since noon, the men walked the road with lanterns and called into the creek and called into the trees the way you call a dog, but know you are calling something else too. Miss Hart told them he had stayed to copy his geography because he was proud of his map of the Ohio, and he must have left after she locked up. It was late and cold. "I will walk with you and call," she said, and she did, with a voice like a bell. In her notes after, she wrote "withdrawn" beside his name and a small, neat X. The sheriff wrote up a missing person, but in 1873, the word missing did not do what it does to a town today. Men left and returned when they could. Boys ran off to see a railroad. A child could fall through a crack in life, and the world would simply flow over him because the world had to. Still, 2 weeks later, when the creek thawed and gave up a bundle of clothes snagged on a branch, a shirt Caleb's mother recognized by the mended cuff, anyone who had a doubt stopped admitting it to themselves. Mothers began arriving at dismissal early. Fathers walked boys to the door and waited on the road with their hands in their coat pockets, watching the bell. Miss Hart started keeping the littlest in for quiet rest after lunch, which she said was good for growing brains. She lowered the window shades in the afternoons because the light made the children fidget. A neighbor who had never paid attention to the school noticed that the stove burned hard even on mild days, as if what needed heating never got warm. Eliza's ledger from that spring, preserved now in a library box where people breathe softly, looks like the inside of a clock. Column after column in ink you could mistake for tiny iron filings, attendance marked in crisp ticks, absences circled with a light hand, as if to be kind. Then the second ledger begins, hidden in the back, turned upside down so it would read from the other direction and not be noticed by someone paging through carelessly. That ledger is a cook's book and something else. It lists barley, carrots, bones, salt, bay. Then it lists names, first names, diminutives, the way an adult who likes children says them beside words like portion and half. No quantities a grocer would understand. No weights to order by. It reads like a prayer list, copied into a recipe. In April, a traveling photographer came through with a tent and a chair and a black cloth, offering tintypes on the cheap. He set up in front of the church and persuaded the whole class to sit as a gift for the school. The image that came out is famous now for a detail no one remarked that day. A row of children looking past the lens the way country children do when you tell them to stare and hold still. A teacher on the left side of the frame, hands crossed at the waist, and at the edge near the porch, the square outline of new lumber set into older boards, a trapdoor that had not been in last summer's painting. You can show someone else the picture and say, "Look," and they will nod and pretend. But if you live near there, you feel the wrongness in your ribs before you can say why. After the class sat for the photographer, the town looked at their children in novelty, as if the lens had frozen them and might keep them. And then the spring chores rolled down, and you cannot halt a spring. A second child did not come home, a girl this time, Addie Lang, small for her age with eyes that tilted like questions. Addie's father was working a section gang on the rail and came home only every other Sunday. Her mother had a baby at the breast and a toddler with a cough. Addie stayed late often, Miss Hart said, to clean erasers and sweep and help prepare the pot for morning, which was the sort of helping poor children did to earn what they were given without being scolded. Addie had no shoes in the picture. When her mother came to the door at dusk, and Miss Hart opened it with the lamp behind her, the teacher said Addie had left before the bell, surely walked with the Rollins boys, and chattered and forgotten to turn at the lane. Simple as a bird losing the branch it meant to land on. The mother stood a long time on the porch after the door shut, and listened to the stove ticking as it cooled. Then she went home and wrapped the baby in a shawl and went to fetch the sheriff. There are moments when a town's blood stops pretending to move. The sheriff sent for help from the next county. Men knocked on the widow Tally's door and looked into the boarded-up lean-to she rented to Miss Hart for her supplies. Someone said they should search the school, and someone else said they could not without a warrant, because the board had trusted Miss Hart with the keys. And while they argued in the soft, careful way men argue when they fear being wrong, the bell in the belfry rang once. No hand touched it. It was the wind, someone said, and someone else said, "The wind has rung that bell before." The men agreed they were hungry and would take broth at the widow's, and they did. And later they could not remember the taste, except to say it reminded them of something they did not want to recall. The person who finally broke the weather was not a father or a sheriff. It was a boy named Simon Brennan, 15, narrow-shouldered, quick with numbers, whose younger brother had been transferred to another county school when the family moved to be nearer the railroad, and who had promised his mother to bring an arithmetic book back to the teacher the next time he visited old friends. Simon had a way of listening that made people speak. When he walked into the schoolhouse that Friday afternoon, the room looked like a place asleep with its eyes open. Desks straight, slates stacked, the dust of chalk floating where the sun slanted through a slice in the shade. Miss Hart stood at her desk with the ledger open. She did not startle. "You've grown," she said in that measured voice. "Men always do when they leave." She took the book, turned it over, set it aside, and asked him if he would like a bowl. It had been a long walk, and he would not say no. She ladled without spilling, hand steady, and watched him lift the spoon, the same bright attention she paid to all children. When he swallowed, he felt warmth run down to his stomach and radiate like a stove warming a cold house. He did not like that feeling, but he kept eating because a boy must not waste food under a woman's gaze. "Have you heard," she asked, "how the railroad brings strangers who do not belong to any of us?" Simon nodded because the railroad had taken and given, and his father talked about it even in his sleep, making a sound in his throat, like a nail being pulled through wood. And how some of those strangers are not good men. Simon nodded again, because he had seen a man in a town up the line sell a watch to a boy, and then take it back when the boy cried. "I have to keep my pupils safe," she said, and she said, pupils like a needle, not children, but the round, dark center of something that must stay small for the world to be readable. Do you understand? He said he did, because he wanted to be thanked, and then be free to walk to his old friend's place and laugh about a teacher being strange. The basement is where I keep what is safest, she added, and smiled with her whole face as always. When he left, he did not tell anyone what she had said, because the words felt like a thread that would tangle if he pulled it alone. That night, he dreamt of the trapdoor outline caught in the tintype, and woke with his hand cramped into a fist and a taste in his mouth he could not name. The next morning, he walked to the sheriff and asked to see the ledger, which annoyed the sheriff until the boy said please in a voice that sounded like a man's. The sheriff showed him the roll, and the boy's finger fell to the column of little X marks as if it had been guided. Why are they all marked the same way? Simon asked, and the sheriff said teachers like their marks neat. Why do the marks stop the week of the new door? The sheriff looked, frowned, and swore softly the way men do when they realize the world has already moved while they were arguing about it. On Sunday, while half the town sang inside St. Luke's and the others chorused outside with the hymn through the open windows, Simon and the sheriff, with the storekeeper and a quiet deacon to witness, walked to the schoolhouse. They knocked. No one answered. They used the key the board kept for emergencies, a key that had never before been in a palm for any reason other than to comfort a man with the fact of its cold weight. Inside it was hot, as if the stove were embarrassed and sweating. The sheriff opened the desk drawer and took out the ledger and a second book that had been tucked under it, small and bound in oilcloth. He put both in his coat. The men stood by the trapdoor and made a conversation of looks no one wanted to put into words. Then the sheriff went to the window and raised the shade, because sometimes a little sun makes a wicked thought back down. He nodded to the storekeeper. They pried the square up with a crowbar and a carpenter's pry, where the nails had been set deep and painted over. The smell that came up was not rot. Rot is a smell you can blame on the world. This was a smell like cooking that heard its name and stopped singing. The stairs went down into a space big enough to call a room, stone walls, pegged shelf, the coal pile stacked neat, a row of jars with cloth lids soaked in wax, a wooden table scrubbed too clean. The shoe on the step, the ledger beside it, a folded apron with a little smear at the hem, the color of an apple peeled thin and left to darken. On a peg by the stairs hung a ring of keys. On a line strung along the far wall hung 10 dinner pails, each with a name scratched into the tin. One pail still smelled like peppermint, another smelled like soap. What they didn't see is as important as what they did. No bodies, no bones on the table. Nothing you could point to and say a crime had occurred here, because a crime like this hides in what's missing. On the shelf under the stairs sat a blue china bowl with a single hair ribbon curled in its belly. Beside it lay a folded paper with measurements written in Miss Hart's hand. The paper read, like a woman talking to herself. Carrots when sweet, it said, a handful of barley to quiet the broth. Then, under a line drawn like a seam, portions for 12, and the names of children in small, perfect script. Behind the coal pile was a gap in the stone you could pass through sideways into a smaller cold, where the earth crouched up against old lumber. In that cavity, they would later find what they had not imagined they would. Not the boys or the girls, but pieces of the world that had touched them. A slate still cloudy with chalk, a button worked loose by restless hands, the broken bow of a shoe, and near the floor, where a child might have hidden it from the fear in another child's eyes, a stick of peppermint snapped clean in the middle. Miss Hart was not at church that day. The widow Tally told the deputies Eliza had said she had a headache and would lie down. Her bed was made, the blanket smoothed like a pond in no wind. Her brooch lay on the washstand next to a small tin of salt. The widow Tally said she had never known a woman to leave her brooch in the daylight. A neighbor boy saw her walking toward the creek with a basket and then lost her when the path dipped. The sheriff sent riders down both banks. A hat was found, caught in a snag. A basket lid washed into reeds. By the time the men pushed through sawgrass to the bend, where the current slows the way, a hand eases at the hip. It was dusk, and the frogs were tuning. And if you want to make a town tell itself anything you like, you only have to let the light fail and leave them one object to hold up in the dark. They found her shawl on a rock. They said she had gone into the water. They said the river had claimed her. If a man had done it, they would have said other words. But for a woman, they used the river because a river does not argue. The trial never happened because a trial requires a defendant, and the county's money requires an end. But the ledger happened. The deacon read it with his lips moving, and then pressed his lips so tight the color went away. The sheriff showed it to the judge, who read with his ears turning the color of a cold man's fingers. Mothers came to the schoolhouse porch and stood, hands on the rail, until the board finally put a chain across the door and nailed up a notice in a hand that shook, closed until further action of the county. The general store took the stew bones off the inventory list because no one wanted to hear the word bones in a place that sold candy. A few of the pails were returned to families who had not asked for them, an act that made men put their faces in their hands. The townspeople agreed, without ever quite saying so, to stop talking about names and talk about children, because it is easier to grieve a word than a person you might see running down the hill in your mind forever. Months later, when a surveyor came out to look at the property line for reasons that had nothing to do with terror. Fences are fences even when the wind carries a story. He found, in a corner of the cellar, the men had overlooked in their panic, a locked wooden box with corners worn smooth by careful hands. The lock was too good for a knife and not worth a locksmith's fee, so they used a hammer that cracked the lid and their nerve at the same time. Inside lay small objects wrapped in clean cloth, a ring made of hair on a ribbon, a broken slate pencil, 3 marbles that did not match, a little tin with a peppermint or two, and 2 withered pieces of apple, and notes in Miss Hart's hand that would not any of them understand for the rest of their lives. Quiet, one said, as if she were reminding herself to be it. Hunger is the loudest child, another said, and I am telling you, it makes a man stand up and walk outside into the weather to read a sentence like that where God can hear. You are going to ask the question people always ask next, because we need simple wickedness we can hold in our hands. Did she eat them? The ledger never says the word. The judge's face never said the word. The sheriff's grandchildren say today that their grandfather never cooked stew again because it made his throat go tight. But the jars on the shelf were labeled with a code the grocer could not decipher, and when the jars were opened, they did not smell like anything a kitchen ought to smell like. They smelled like a story that has made up its mind. If you want to sleep tonight, tell yourself it means nothing. If you want the truth, all you need to do is think about a woman who watched children's faces as they tasted and wrote in a book about who praised the flavor most. The part no one counts on in a story like this is the way shame walks in and sits down. It works slow as winter. It makes mothers stand in their own kitchens and sniff pots, as if the past could ride steam back out of a house. It makes men who did not look hard enough at the first missing boy notice stand in the next county courthouse with a hat in their hands, asking if a man had been there with a wagon. It makes neighbors decide, without speaking, to move the conversation to crops. And shame loves an empty building as much as it loves a crowded table. The board did not fight when a traveling evangelist said the schoolhouse should be burned for the sake of the children. They let him, because if you light a place on fire, the smoke will take some of the story up with it, where it cannot bother you in the night. The bell melted into a puddle like a frozen pond meeting a hot spring. The trap door, pulled and tossed into the flames, made a sound so loud a woman fainted, because it was the same sound she had heard in a dream. But burning a place is not the same as mending a wound. The railroad kept on. The creek kept on. Another teacher came, a man this time, as if a throat clearing. He taught in the church basement until a new school went up with windows on all four sides, so shadows could not grow long anywhere. The new school had no cellar. It kept its coal in a shed so that every man who signed the purchase order would have to see the black pile and remember. Mothers visited at noon and brought bread instead of trusting a pot. The county wrote a rule that said teachers must board with a family and take supper in a room where someone could hear a spoon in a bowl. Another rule said the board must see the keys twice a year. Rules are the things we write when we want the past to behave like an object that will stay where we set it. Years later, a traveling lecturer came through with a box of bones and a chalkboard and a battered hat to pass for coins, telling stories about criminals of the age and the science of catching them. He lectured in the courthouse and made a brisk business with a story from Kansas about a family who ran an inn where travelers vanished, and a story from the mountains about a woman with a pot always on the boil. People in the crowd of Cedar Hollow did not laugh at his jokes. They did not applaud his moral at the end about vigilance. They looked at one another the way people do when a stranger has told their story back to them and called it news. When he asked if anyone had questions, no one stood up. When he finished and tipped his hat, a woman in the back row took her son's hand and went outside into the night air because she could not abide the heat of that room 1 second longer. It is tempting to end the story with the shawl on the rock, the ledger in the judge's hands, the schoolhouse ash, and call it closed. But Cedar Hollow kept breathing, and so did the story, in small ways that people who study crimes will tell you matter more than you think. A butcher in the county began to sharpen his knives at the end of the day instead of the beginning, because beginning the day with a blade made him think of Miss Hart's careful hands. A deacon refused to eat sausage at weddings and did not say why, and when people teased him, he smiled and put a roll on his plate instead. In the new school, a boy asked the new teacher what portion meant, and the man could not speak for a moment, and then spelled it on the slate and said, "It means a share," and tried not to look at the stove, even though the stove was cold. A farm wife found her daughter standing by the creek, looking at a rock with a shawl over it, as if the rock would give her an answer, and she walked her home without saying the woman's name, because names are doors, and you do not open all doors with children in the house. There is a piece of paper in the county records, filed between a land deed and a tax notice, and it is not out of place there if you do not know what you are looking at. It is a letter in the same careful hand as the ledger, written to no one and never sent. The clerk who found it decades later folded it back into the file and told his wife that night that he had touched the inside of a storm. "Hunger teaches many lessons," the letter says, "and those who have not been hungry do not know how loud a lesson can be. I am a good teacher. I quiet the loud ones first. When they are quiet, the others can hear. That is all. There is no sorry, no why. There is only the clockwork of a mind that made order from fear and called the order good." A year after the schoolhouse burned, the county put up a marker on the spot, because even when towns say they do not want a thing remembered, they build something to point at, because forgetting is too slippery to trust. The marker does not give names. It says, for the children kept here, as if the keeping were the part that mattered, and the rest were a rumor made of smoke. Folks leave little things at the base without telling each other they will do it. A marble, a ribbon, a peppermint that ants find by morning. At Christmas, an old man brings a tarnished bell clapper he says he found in ashes and sets it against the stone and presses his hand to it, with his eyes closed and his mouth moving. And if you do not know why, it looks like prayer. Every few years, a writer from a bigger town will come through and ask questions. They will look at the creek and at the new school and at the marker and at the photograph with the square of new lumber, and will say something sharp about the 19th century and how different we are now. Someone will walk them to their carriage or their car and wish them a safe drive, and then go home and stand in their own kitchen and lift the lid from a pot and inhale the steam like a person checking the forecast. They will think about the face of a woman who watched children taste and wrote about it as if she were mapping a river. They will sit at the table and eat with their family and make conversation about the day and try not to taste what the town tasted and try not to remember what it learned. That evil, when it comes dressed as a lesson plan and a neat hem and a lunch program, does not look like evil at all. And the only alarm you may get is a bell. The wind rings once on a Sunday. If you grew up with a one-room school in your town, you already know the sound a floor makes under a row of small feet, and the sight of a teacher's shadow crossing the same plank over and over until wood learns its weight. You know how a coal stove teaches patience, and how a winter pot can carry a house through a week, and how a ledger can look like care until you read the names in a different light. You know, too, that people hunger for more than food. They hunger for order, for control, for a world that does not take from them first. Most of us teach that hunger to stand in the corner and be quiet. Some of us feed it. One of us fed it in the basement. When you pass Cedar Hollow on your way to a place where the road straightens out and the signs get bigger, you might think of Miss Eliza Hart and her ledger and the trap door and use the word monster, because monsters settle the stomach like bread. But the ledger is written in script even the new teacher admired, because he could not help himself. The pot boiled the way every pot boils. The cellar was built to hold roots and coal. The brooch was a flower, the ring a memory, the shawl a shawl. What makes a town into a caution is not a cloak or a charm or a curse. It is the unremarkable way an ordinary door can open downward. It is a bell that rings once and makes a man decide in his heart that the sound was the wind and not what it was. It is our willingness to eat what we are given, if it is warm, and handed to us by someone who says she is keeping us safe. The teacher who kept her students in the basement did not live 100 miles from anyone else's life. She lived exactly where we do, on the line between trust and hunger, between the classroom and the cellar. If you listen, you can still hear the bowl set down, the careful stirring, the voice at the front of the room saying, be still now. We will begin. Before you click away, tell me in the comments what your town's oldest building is, and if the basement ever made you uneasy. It helps the algorithm, and it helps us remember that history doesn't vanish when we burn its house down. It lingers in recipes and ledgers, and the way a bell sounds when no hand is on the rope. Stay safe on the road home. Keep your kitchen windows open when you cook. And wherever you send your children, make sure the door opens up to the sky.